The day my brother stood up in that conference room and said, "She has no place here." She never did. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table, watching him the way you watch someone walk toward a cliff they don't know is there. I should back up. My name is Sloane. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was the family afterthought, not the black sheep. Black sheep at least get attention. I was more like the furniture nobody notices until they need somewhere to set their drink. My father built Hargrove Capital from nothing, literally nothing. A 2-room office in Raleigh, North Carolina, a used desk he bought off Craigslist, and 30 years of 18-hour days. By the time I was in high school, Hargrove Capital managed north of $200 million in private equity holdings. My father had his name on a building downtown. He got invited to things. He mattered. My brother Owen mattered too, by extension. 4 years older than me, better at golf, better at shaking hands, better at being the version of my father that my father wanted to see walking around. Owen went to Duke. Owen joined the firm right out of undergrad. Owen had the corner office by 26. I went to UNC Charlotte on a partial scholarship because my father decided the money was better spent elsewhere. I don't say that to sound bitter. I say it because it matters later. I studied finance. Not because my father pushed me toward it. He didn't push me toward anything, but because I was genuinely good at it. Numbers made sense to me in a way that most things in my family didn't. I graduated with honors. I got a job at a mid-size investment firm in Charlotte, and I kept my head down and I learned everything I could about how money actually moves in this country. Not the cocktail party version, but the real version. The documentation, the structures, the leverage. My father never asked me about my job. Not once. When the family got together for holidays, he and Owen talked about the firm, about deals, about clients. My mother sometimes asked me if I was seeing anyone. That was about the extent of my participation in Hargrove family life. I didn't hate them. I want to be clear about that. I just stopped expecting anything. When I was 27, I did something that changed everything, though no one in my family knew it at the time. I'd been saving aggressively since my first paycheck. No car payments. 1-bedroom apartment, brown bag lunch every single day. I had enough for a down payment on a small commercial property in a part of Charlotte that I'd been watching for 3 years. A neighborhood that was about to become valuable. I bought a 4-unit mixed-use building on a corner lot for just under $600,000. I financed it through a private lender, structured the loan carefully, and within 18 months, I'd refinanced at a much better rate because the building had appreciated nearly 40%. I used that equity to buy another property, then another. I kept everything under an LLC, Alderton Holdings, and I kept it quiet. Not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I'd learned a long time ago that telling my family good news only seemed to invite them to figure out how to benefit from it. By the time I was 30, Alderton Holdings had 7 properties and roughly $4 million in equity. I had a property manager. I had a good CPA. I was doing fine. My father did not know any of this. What my father knew was that I worked some finance job in Charlotte and that I rented an apartment somewhere near uptown. What Owen knew was roughly the same. I was the little sister who didn't quite make it into the family business, who showed up at Christmas and ate the food and left without making much of an impression either way. That was fine with me. The problem started when Hargrove Capital hit a wall. I heard it from my mother first. In one of her calls where she mentioned things sideways without actually saying them. Your father's been stressed. Then, a few weeks later, Owen's been working so hard. I just wish things were easier for him right now. Then my father himself called, which almost never happened, to ask if I knew anyone who might be a good contact for bridge financing. I knew exactly what bridge financing meant. It meant the firm was cash poor and needed short-term capital to cover a gap while they waited on a deal to close. It happens. It's not a death sentence if you handle it right. I asked a few careful questions. The answers I got told me the situation was worse than bridge financing. 2 deals had gone sideways. A major client had pulled 7 figures out of the fund. The firm had payroll coming up and obligations they couldn't meet on paper. I told my father I'd look into some contacts. I didn't sleep much that night. What I did over the next 2 weeks was not something I'm going to apologize for. but I want to be precise about it so no one misunderstands. I did my research. I pulled every public record I could find on Hargrove Capital. I talked to my CPA and my attorney, and then I did something that was, from a purely financial standpoint, very logical. Through Alderton Holdings, I structured a secured loan to Hargrove Capital, $2.4 million at a reasonable interest rate with the firm's equipment, client contracts, and physical office lease listed as collateral. The paperwork was clean. My attorney drafted it. Everything was above board, filed correctly, documented to the letter. My father signed it without reading past the first page. I know because I watched him on a video call, flipping to the signature line while Owen talked over him about something else. They needed the money, and Alderton Holdings was offering it at better terms than any bank would. They didn't ask who owned Alderton Holdings. I didn't offer. That was 18 months before the conference room. The meeting was called because my father wanted to formally transition the firm's leadership to Owen. There was an estate planning component, a restructuring component, and I found out 2 days before, a component in which my father intended to inform me that I was not receiving any equity stake in the firm and that my role going forward would be limited to a courtesy seat on the advisory board, non-voting. My mother told me this over the phone and then said, "I hope you understand, sweetheart, Owen has put in so much time." I told her I understood. I told her I'd be there. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building in Raleigh that my father had leased for 20 years. Big windows. A long mahogany table that he'd always been proud of. There were about 12 people in the room. My father, Owen, Owen's wife, 2 attorneys, a financial advisor, a CPA, and various people whose exact function I was never fully clear on. I came alone. I sat near the end of the table, which is where they'd put my nameplate. End of the table, which is where they put my nameplate. Not quite in the room, not quite out of it. Owen started talking almost immediately. He had prepared remarks. He talked about vision, about growth, about being a steward of what our father had built. He was good at this. He'd always been good at this. He'd always been good at this. People nodded. Then my father spoke. He talked about legacy. He talked about the sacrifices he'd made. He talked about Owen as though Owen were the physical manifestation of everything he'd ever worked for. It went on for a while. At some point, he gestured toward me. "Sloane has always done her own thing. I respect that." The way he said it did not sound like respect. But this firm needs someone who's been here, someone who understands what it takes. Owen, without looking at me, said, "She has no place here. She never did." And then he kept talking like he'd just said something unremarkable, like he'd noted the weather. I looked at my hands. I thought about the building I'd bought at 27. I thought about the 18 months of payments Hargrove Capital had made to Alderton Holdings. Payments that had, 2 months ago, stopped. 3 missed payments. I'd sent formal notices. I'd received 2 calls from Owen saying they'd get current soon. I hadn't heard from them since. The financial advisor started walking through a slide deck about the restructuring. Numbers on a screen. I watched them without commenting. About 40 minutes into the meeting, one of the attorneys, a man named Douglas, who I'd met twice before and who had always looked at me the way people look at something they can't quite place, started reviewing the firm's debt obligations, mortgages, credit lines, vendor contracts. He paused on one line item. "There's a secured loan here from an entity called Alderton Holdings, $2.4 million, currently showing 3 missed payments and in technical default under the terms of the agreement." He looked up. "I don't have good documentation on who holds this note." Owen frowned. That's the bridge loan from last year. We're working on getting current." Douglas looked at me. I'm not sure why he looked at me. Maybe something in my stillness. My father looked at me too. I reached into the leather portfolio I'd set on the table when I walked in. I took out a 12-page document. Copies for everyone, because I'd brought enough copies for everyone, and I slid them down the table. "Alderton Holdings is my company," I said. "Has been for 4 years. I'm the sole managing member, and I hold the note on this loan." The room got very quiet. Owen's mouth opened. He didn't say anything. My father picked up the document. He turned pages. I watched his face. Under the terms of the loan agreement, I said, 3 consecutive missed payments constitute default and trigger the acceleration clause. The full outstanding principal, $2.4 million, is now due. Additionally, as the senior secured creditor, I have a first priority claim on the collateral listed in Schedule A. I paused. That includes the firm's equipment, the client service contracts, and the physical office space. Douglas was reading very carefully now. He turned to page 7. You turned to page 9. He said nothing. Owen found his voice. You can't just. The loan documents were signed by Dad, I said. They're valid. They've been on file with the county recorder's office since the date of origination. You can verify everything I'm telling you. My father put the document down. He looked at me in a way I'd never seen him look at me before. Not angry exactly. Something else. Something that looked almost like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and wasn't sure what to make of what he saw. Sloane, he said. Just my name. I sent 3 default notices, I said. I made 2 phone calls that Owen returned with a vague promise to get current. I did not receive a payment. I did not receive a payment. I did not receive a plan. I received silence. Owen stood up. This is a setup. You planned this. You came in here knowing I came in here, I said, because I was invited. You're the ones who planned a meeting to remove me from any stake in this family's business. I just came prepared. One of the attorneys on Owen's side, a woman named whatever, she barely matters to the story, started whispering to him rapidly. He sat back down. Douglas cleared his throat. If the default is valid and the acceleration clause is enforceable, the firm would need to either cure the default or I take possession of the collateral, I said. Yes, my father had not looked away from me. How long have you been doing this? He asked. The properties. Alderton. 4 years, I said, give or take. He was quiet for a moment. You never said anything. You never asked, I said. And I said it very gently because I wasn't trying to wound him. It was just the truth. Owen slammed his hand on the table. Not hard enough to be dramatic, hard enough to be desperate. Dad, she's trying to take the firm. This is what she's been working toward. She's been waiting for us to need money so she could. Owen. My father's voice was flat. Stop. Owen stopped. The room was quiet for a long time, long enough that I could hear the air conditioning cycling, long enough that Owen's wife, who had not said a single word, quietly picked up her coffee cup and put it back down without drinking from it. What do you want? My father asked me. I had thought about this question for a long time. I had thought about it in my car on the drive up. I had thought about it at 3 in the morning, more times than I could count. I want the default cured, I said. Full payment of the outstanding balance within 60 days, plus the default interest. That's in the contract. I paused. If the firm can't do that, then we go through the collateral process as specified. I'm not interested in punishing anyone. I'm interested in being treated like someone who has something to offer. My father looked at Owen. Owen was staring at the table. The advisory board seat, my father said slowly. Non-voting. I'd like to discuss that, I said. Douglas very quietly said, I think that's a reasonable position. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not a fairy tale. My father and I had a long, hard, uncomfortable conversation. The first real conversation we'd had since I was maybe 17 years old. Owen didn't speak to me for the first 3 weeks. The firm brought in an outside mediator to work through the debt restructuring, and Alderton Holdings agreed to a modified repayment schedule that worked for everyone. I got a voting seat on the board, not because my father suddenly understood me, or because everything was magically healed, but because Douglas had looked at the Alderton Holdings portfolio, and then looked at my father and said, With respect, sir, your daughter has been running a more sophisticated operation than most people in this room. My father had nodded slowly, like he was putting something together that had been in pieces for a long time. Owen came around eventually, not quickly and not without some hard words exchanged on the Tuesday evening in my father's kitchen, when it was just the 3 of us and nobody was performing for anyone. He said he'd spent so long being the one who showed up that he'd never stopped to wonder if showing up was the only way to matter. I didn't say anything to that. Sometimes silence is the right answer. My mother called me the week after the meeting and asked if I was doing okay. I told her I was fine. She said, "I didn't know, sweetheart, about your company, about any of it." I told her I knew she didn't. She said, "I'm proud of you." It was the first time she'd said that and meant it in a way that didn't feel like a consolation prize. I still own all 7 properties. Alderton Holdings is up to 9 now, actually. I closed on 2 more in the spring. I still have the original Charlotte building, the one I bought at 27 with money I saved 1 paycheck at a time. I'm not going to pretend the family is fixed. It's not. There are still Sunday dinners where the silence between Owen and me has a particular texture. There are still moments when my father calls me by name and there's something careful in it, like he's remembering to include me, and I can feel the old habit underneath, the one where I wasn't quite real to him. But I sit at the table now. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean I have a chair at the actual table, and my nameplate is not at the end of it anymore. And when someone presents numbers in that conference room on the 14th floor, they look at me when they want to know if the numbers are right. That's enough. For now, that's enough. I still think about that moment when Douglas slid my loan documents down the table and the room went quiet. Not the dramatic kind of quiet you see in movies, just air. The kind of silence that happens when 12 people are all realizing the same thing at the same time, and none of them have words for it yet. What I want to say, what I've been turning over since that day, is that nothing in that room happened by accident. Not the way my brother dismissed me, not the way my father signed without reading, and not the way I was ready when it mattered. Every single piece of it was cause and effect, playing out exactly the way it had to. Owen spent years treating me like a footnote because no one ever stopped him. Not out of cruelty exactly, more like habit. When a family decides early on who matters and who doesn't, that decision gets reinforced every holiday, every phone call, every time someone talks over you at dinner. The world he lived in told him I was background noise, so he believed it, and that belief made him careless. And that carelessness put him in a room where the person he'd written off was holding the note on his entire future. That's not luck. That's just what happens when you underestimate someone long enough. What I built over those 4 years wasn't just a real estate portfolio. It was the result of deciding, quietly, privately, without anyone's permission, that I was going to know things. Really, know them. Not the version of finance you perform at cocktail parties, but the actual mechanics, how debt is structured, how collateral works, what senior secured creditor means in a room full of lawyers. I read. I ask questions. I hired people smarter than me in specific areas, and I listened to them. Knowledge isn't glamorous when you're acquiring it. It's mostly just showing up and doing the unglamorous work of understanding something fully, rather than mostly. That's the part no one in my family saw. They saw the absence of me. They didn't see what the absence was filled with. And then there's the part that's harder to talk about, which is the years it took to not give up. I saved money when my friends were buying things. I made decisions that felt lonely at the time. There were nights I second-guessed the whole thing. The LLC, the properties, the choice to stay quiet and build instead of fight for a seat at a table I hadn't earned yet. Grit is an ugly word for an ugly thing. It's not inspiring while you're in it. It's just making the same decision over and over to keep going when stopping would be so much easier. My father asked me why I never said anything. I told him you never asked. But the fuller answer is that I didn't need permission to become someone. I just needed time. Owen called me 3 weeks after the meeting. We talked for almost 2 hours. At one point, he said he'd spent so long being visible that he never considered what invisible people do with their time. I thought that was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. The table has more seats than you think. You just have to be ready when the chair opens up.